Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I think there might still be some folks coming in, but thanks so much for joining us tonight for a terrific, and it's going to be a really terrific session of Engine of Impact, Essentials of Strategic Leadership in the Nonprofit Sector. I'm Georgia Levinson-Cohan. I am the Executive Director of the Pershing Square Foundation, but more relevant for tonight, I also teach a course on social entrepreneurship at the Tamer Center. So I recognize some of you from my classrooms, from other events we've done here. And I just wanted to thank Sandra Navali, who I saw, and Diana Rambeau, and Damon Phillips, and Bruce Usher, and other colleagues and fellow travelers at the Tamer Center. Mostly, I wanted to thank Bill Meehan and Kim Jonker, the authors of the book we're going to speak about tonight. I feel a little bit like Dave Letterman and his new show, like my next guest needs no introduction. My guests this evening really need no introduction, but I will introduce them a little bit and then we'll jump in. So I think the game plan for this evening is I will ask some questions probably for about 40, 45 minutes, we'll see, and then open it up to questions. Then I'm told you have to buy a book before you can go get more food. So you buy a book before you get more food, and then we'll all sort of hang out for a reception. So good plan. So I've known both Bill Meehan and Kim Jonker for years and years and years, and I'm delighted to be able to do this tonight, both professionally and personally. Bill Meehan is the Lafayette Partners Lecturer at Stanford Business School in Strategic Management, and also Director Emeritus at McKinsey & Company. So I first crossed paths with Bill, I'm not sure if he remembers, at McKinsey, where he was for 30 years the founder and leader of a number of practices there, including private equity and technology, and led the San Francisco office. But perhaps more interesting for tonight's discussion, also has taught at Stanford on nonprofit leadership for 20 years, and 20 years translates into thousands of students. So even though Bill cops a good West Coast game, he actually has very deep Morningside and Columbia roots. So we're very happy to have you back.
Graduate of Columbia College, 1974.
And I think we will all enjoy more Columbia stories this evening, I hope. I'm planning on it. And then to my left, Kim Starkey Jonker, also dear old friend, colleague. I have huge respect for her. Currently the CEO of King Philanthropies, which is an extraordinary West Coast-based family foundation that fights poverty across the world. And Kim's job there is to identify and then harness grants to really extraordinary organizations, some of whom are featured in the book and in our discussion tonight, that are fighting poverty worldwide. Both Kim and Bill have very deep, extensive experience in both the for-profit sector and the nonprofit sector. And as they say in the book, they have, when it comes to nonprofit leadership and management, they themselves have played just about every role imaginable with nonprofits. So as executives, as board members, as donors, as beneficiaries, as evaluators, as consultants, and now as longstanding authors, and now as an author of this book. So I guess I'd love to just start with some basic questions for you both. Writing a book, although from a distance seems like it's a huge amount of fun and a walk in a park, walk in Morningside, is pretty arduous. So how did you even come to the idea of writing this book? What's sort of the genesis of the book? Tell us about it. Kim.
Well, it all can be traced back to 2005, when I started overseeing the Henry Kravis Prize in Nonprofit Leadership. And our charge was to identify extraordinary leaders and their organizations in the sector. And we looked far and wide across the globe for 10 years and identified a number of just amazing, tremendous leaders and organizations. One of them that comes to mind is Roy Prosterman. He was our inaugural prize recipient. And he's 82 years old now and still works tirelessly to alleviate extreme poverty. And his organization, it's now called Landesa. At the time, it was the Rural Development Institute. It all started for Roy more than 50 years ago. In the midst of the Vietnam War, he was in the rice paddies, and he came upon a profound and very important insight. And that was that land ownership can be a critical path out of extreme poverty. People who work on the land, which is the vast majority of people in extreme poverty, that by owning a small plot, it can actually be the thing that pulls them out. And he went on to create this organization, which secured land rights for people. And over the course of many decades, his interventions impacted more than 100 million families. That's more than 400 million people. And what's really interesting and got me started and was really the genesis for this book is thinking about, well, what are the drivers of this extraordinary impact? And it's easy to think that it's budget. Must have so many donations and it just, enormous budget. But in fact, they had operated on a shoestring budget for many, many years. In the early years, for the first 20 years, they had a budget of less than $2 million. And they worked out of a small apartment, all the staff, the small apartment in downtown Seattle. And it was so small that they kept half of the files in the bathtub, and they kept the other half on the stove. And so it was this process of saying, okay, well, if it's not budget, what is it? What are the factors that drive extraordinary outsized impact in the sector? And with the Kravis Prize, we went on to have many extraordinary organizations, BRAC, Protham, Escuela Nueva, Helen Keller International, just so many wonderful organizations. And we would bring them together for these peer learning retreats. And what was interesting, Bill led them with me, and what was interesting is that even though they were diverse organizations working in different places, on different issues, there was a great deal of similarity in their experiences. So much similarity in not only the things that worked well, but also in their challenges. And so it was that insight that led Bill and I to start this research as we tried to identify what are the main factors that lead to strong impact in the sector.
So I warned Georgia and Kim that since I got out of Columbia College in 1974, I was going to tell one Columbia story. And so I'm going to go back much longer than Kim's. I was an English and comparative literature major, graduated in 1974. And just for the purposes of the story, 44 years ago tonight, it was cold, it was raining. And you can't believe, well, some of you can believe it, but it was, there was none of this internships or something. I went to the placement office as an English major. I was eligible apparently to become a trainee for any number of very attractive life insurance sales companies that was happening. And so one, again, for the purpose of the story, I was walking across South Field, which still had no grass from 3 or 4 years ago when the tactical police had brought the horses onto campus to keep the students from doing whatever they were doing. And I bumped into a classmate of mine, Steve Seidel. I said, Steve, I'm looking for a job. And he said, well, I'm working for a guy in a place downtown and we need another researcher. And 2 nights later, I was having dinner west of Fifth Avenue at a Brazilian restaurant with a guy named Bill Drayton. He was then an associate at McKinsey. And 10 years later, Bill founded Ashoka and widely is credited with launching the movement called social entrepreneurship. And literally 75% of the facts of my life, including ending up writing this book, came from that chance meeting on South Field. Beyond that, Kim and I have worked together since she was a student of mine at Stanford and an associate at McKinsey, and have grown together. Kim used to do what I told her, we're now full partners, which, shall we say, has its satisfactions as well as frustrations to me because she now tells me what to do.
So terrific. So one of the things that you will see when you get your own copies of the book that I really like, it's not only that you've distilled these essentially 7 lessons and ideas, but you've also come up with this brilliant metaphor of an engine that also has a great picture. So I actually have read the book and have, I think, on whatever page that is, but we see the 7 elements depicted both metaphorically and graphically as sort of engines and drivers, Kim, as you said, of impact. And I guess whether it's mission, strategy, metrics, impact evaluation, how we think about boards, I guess I'd love to hear from both of you of all of the, first talk a little bit about the metaphor, sort of why it needs to be an engine, and then are there a handful of examples on any of those dimensions that you think really sort of tell the story best?
Well, the notion of the engine was particularly important because for us, as we see nonprofit organizations, they have to excel at all of these things at the same time. In the same way that an engine, all the parts have to function at a high level at the same time. And if you have a flaw somewhere or a weakness, it can destroy the entire engine and certainly the velocity of the vehicle. And so that's the notion there that, so many organizations, especially when I used to be a consultant, so many organizations would say, oh, well, we're really great at all of these things, and oh yeah, we got this thing over here, but it's all right. And I think the notion here is that that thing over there can actually sink the ship. And so it's very, very important to focus on all of these things at the same time.
And so let me just start with the first element, I think we call it the thrust, which is a clear and focused mission. And so I've taught this course, Strategic Leadership of Nonprofits and Social Ventures, for this will be the 19th year. I added social ventures 5 years ago so the students would think it was cool. Because if you say nonprofits on campus, they go, impact investing. Doing well by doing good. I can get rich by saving the world. Anyway, and so we know definitionally nonprofits are mission-driven organizations. That's what they are. And yet this notion that every nonprofit that's going to have impact should have a clear and focused mission is something that's been skirted around for years. I can go through all the other professors and teachers who write this, and they all fudge it away. And I've done this class, so let's just say over 1,000 students, the third class every year. They have a nonprofit, they review the mission statement. And so during the class, we'll go through 40 or 50 mission statements. And if you sat through this class, you would just absolutely conclude that most nonprofits have mission statements that just don't carry any water. They're vague, they're broad. We think that being vague and broad is inspirational, right? We're gonna alleviate poverty one person at a time, and we're a food bank. Because we know that providing groceries to the poor working class people in San Mateo County, that's not inspirational. We assert in the book, and I believe that we should be able to tell what a nonprofit does from the mission statement. A lot of people just think that that's, what happens if something changes? What happens? And I go, well, tell me how many nonprofits do you know who have achieved their mission and therefore disappear? Well, yeah, I can tell you about the Pediatric AIDS Foundation, I think it was, that guy from Starkey and Hutch, whose wife died tragically from AIDS as well as one of his kids. And it turns out that pediatric AIDS in the US is largely gone, right? And so, yeah, 1 out of thousands of nonprofits might actually achieve its mission or be part of achieving its mission. But by and large, we really just don't worry about that. And so we're just very demanding that a nonprofit, whether you're a board member or an executive or a donor, that you can read the mission statement and learn essentially all the basics about what the nonprofit does and how it achieves it.
Following up on mission, I was struck actually the examples that you gave in the book about organizations that successfully made trades or actually chose just as well not to do something as well. So I think the Landesa example you give on the rural versus urban, and there were a few other really interesting ones that I hadn't thought about, like the Museum of Natural History. So I don't know that there were examples that I hadn't quite thought through where organizations were actually saying no or making trades or not taking funding. Kim, I don't know in your experience, sort of, I mean, I'm also in my other hat, I have a funder, and it's very rare that you encounter organizations that actually walk away from funding.
Right. And it's critically important to stay focused on something very narrow. It's also very, very rare. We did a survey at Stanford, and we had data from 3,000 different respondents representing different organizations. And we asked them how focused or diversified their activities actually were. And 37% said diversified. And it's our perspective that focus beats diversification every time. And so, that's quite a big opportunity for improvement. And what was even more interesting is we asked the same respondents, how focused or diversified do you think your organization should be? So regardless of how it is, how should it, do you think you should be focused, or do you think you should be diversified? And a quarter of the respondents said, oh, we think we're supposed to be diversified. So that to us was very provocative and compelling, because it underscores what we see as one of the greatest viruses in the sector. We call it mission creep and whatnot, but it's just all of this creeping and doing so many things, doing 52 things, when instead they should be doing one thing at best. And there's one other, in terms of specific examples, Georgia, Landesa is one. They had said no to wonderful funding that was coming, that was going to take them away from their focus on rural, and it was going to put them in urban. And it would have been so easy to say yes, and many organizations do, but in fact they declined it, and then they waited until there was another opportunity. First one was in the former Soviet Union, another opportunity in India that enabled them to stay in their focus of rural work. And it was a much bigger opportunity, and it was, a nice example of waiting for your pitch, so to speak.
One of the core elements in the book, and it's like a clear and focused mission. You say it, and you go, no. We think nonprofits should focus on something, in areas where they have a skill that's necessary. Now you heard that, you go, well, of course you should. This mission creep, we've all seen it so many times. Normally it's foundations. And foundations put out an RFP, and all of a sudden a whole bunch of nonprofits say, well, that's not exactly what we do, but we can kind of like repurpose something we're already doing to get that grant. And that's what leads to mission creep. It is the leading virus in the sector. It's just not healthy. People forget most nonprofits are small. 75% of nonprofits in the US are less than $100,000. Even if you're a $10 or $20 million nonprofit, if you're a $10 or $20 million business, you can do one thing well. And yet we'll have all sorts of nonprofits say, oh, no, in order to be successful, we need to do these 4 different things. Well, it just, it might be something you wish were true, it's just not. And donors, board members are often very reluctant to call the question. And so instead, we often have nonprofits who, are trying to do something that they don't have the skill base or the mission to accomplish.
The example I like to use is in the private sector, if a bakery suddenly decided to start manufacturing tennis rackets and developing software, everyone would raise an eyebrow. And when the equivalent happens in the nonprofit sector, typically no one blinks.
I live here, but also Palo Alto, and there's a new concept now in the Valley. It's about 5 or 6 years old, called pivot. Pivot, which you got some startup, and its product market fit doesn't work, and so what do? You pivot. That pivoting, it's an excuse to sort of like do anything. And you're beginning to hear it in the nonprofit sector, we're going to pivot. I'm not sorry, not with my money.
So you both brought up sort of comparisons of nonprofits and for-profits, and and we're obviously here at a business school. You both teach in business school. We're not at a public policy school. We're not across the street at the School of Social Work. So clearly, at some level, we've all agreed that there are pieces from the for-profit and commercial sphere that are relevant to nonprofits. And there are other pieces, and I think one of the chief advantages of the book is actually you have a pretty nuanced view about how far to push those metaphors in the lessons. So talk a little bit about that, where you see the lessons and the practices and the disciplines of business relevant for nonprofits, and where you see the limitations.
May I?
Go.
So listen, I don't think we're proponents of the notion that what nonprofits need is more business-like management. Do they need the rigor? Yes. Do they need the performance ethic? At least as much. Are there some analogies that are very powerful? Yes. So Kim was talking about focus and diversification. One of the challenges, as well as the glories of nonprofit sector, is there is no dependent variable. There is no shareholder value. We're in this era of measurement. We're all for measurement. If you know how to compare an opera with a hospital, you go right ahead and try. It's hard enough to measure an individual category of nonprofits. But is it useful? Yes, there's no question about it. And so the rigor, for sure, the focus versus diversification. If there's 5 things we know about corporate strategy, one is that focus always beats diversification. It just does. And that there's 50, 60 years of corporate data to show that. And we can't show that with nonprofits. You can't really get the data well enough to know. But I'm prepared to say that as a starting point. And so that's an analogy as opposed to direct thing. The other thing I'll say is, I'm sure, how many of you are on boards or have been on boards? And, and there's this whole issue of business people's, the relevance of their knowledge. And to me, you go into most nonprofit board meetings and you have these incredibly successful business people. And they seem to have checked their knowledge at the door. Or they think it's directly applicable. Well, the answer is neither, really. My swing thought for new board members is keep asking stupid questions until you figure out what the smart question is, and keep asking the smart question until you get the answer. And if you don't get the answer in 3 boarding meetings in a row, resign. That's, yes, business level rigor. You should neither think it's exactly like your business, nor should you think that it does not yield to the type of an analytical thinking, rigor, thoughtfulness that you have in business. And so many of us will defer. Many nonprofits have this church and state thing. There are professionals involved that are not our professions. Doctors, nurses, social workers, professors, ballet, dancers, artists. And so many of us are anxious that we might appear stupid or insensitive to what they do. Well, I don't think it's wrong to ask them to explain what it is they do, why they do it, and how will I know when they do it really well versus not as well? I mean, if you're going to ask for another 10 million or another 10,000, that's a very sensible question. Maybe uncomfortable for the head of the ballet corps. But in today's world, particularly, increasingly, it's a sensible question to ask. But just in general, I just want to reinforce, yes, there's lots of knowledge, analysis, rigor that you can bring from the business world. But this notion that the nonprofit sector would improve by being more like businesses, I wouldn't start that. That goes down a path that gets very dangerous and culturally uncomfortable. As we all know, people who dedicate their lives to nonprofits, they're not kind of people who run hedge funds.
Everyone's
God.
tweeting, right?
Yeah.
So Kim,
I don't know why I used that one.
who knows? So Kim, I want to pursue this question a little bit more with some of your expertise. So you, like I, like Bill before us, were trained at McKinsey in strategic planning, strategic analysis, also performance evaluation. And you are, there's no one better than you on both those fronts, I think, in the nonprofit sector. So there we're taking a practice from for-profit and applying that. Talk about the elements of strategy that you think are essential for nonprofits, whether that has to do with strategic planning, what the value is there. Maybe I'll come back to the metrics question in a minute.
I think one of the most important elements of strategy that's highly relevant to the nonprofit sector is this notion of core competencies. Bill mentioned it already. An organization's strategy must be built on a distinctive skill or skills. And especially now as a funder, I can't tell you how many organizations march in the door looking for a grant. And in fact, if you really look at their strategy, it is not built on a distinctive skill. They don't actually have what it takes to execute on the mission that they have. And oftentimes, there is another skill that is quite distinctive and unique that they are not pursuing to the extent that they should. So I think that one's highly useful. The notion of theory of change, very useful as well. That's specific to nonprofits. There's some discussion of that in the book.
And so the chapter's called The Few Strategic Concepts That Matter. I stayed 30 years at McKinsey because I'm a simplifier. And consultants, academics, they're complexifiers. They want you to know how complicated what they know is. And this chapter really is intended for anybody, just to say, here, listen, I mean, if you know these, if you can understand these 3 or 4 relatively straightforward strategic frameworks, you can apply strategy in the nonprofit sector. The theory of change is probably the one thing that's come out of nonprofit strategy in the last 20 years that we embrace. At the centerpiece of the logic of the first part of the book is clear and focused mission, a theory of change which shows logically and maybe empirically how you're going to achieve that mission, a strategy about how you're going to do it, and performance measurement that demonstrates that you're doing it. And you say that at the cocktail party, and again, people go, duh. Well, if you just ask those questions of any nonprofit you're involved in, you will, there's 2 years of great discussion. Nonprofits compete in markets. This is a very controversial statement, but it's true. Now, some of these markets, many social services, compete in markets that are failing. But others, St. Luke's Hospitals, Columbia Business School, ballets, whatever, they all compete in markets, and you have to understand the market dynamics to that, for sure. The other thing I'll refer to is we have a matrix that I particularly love later in the book, where we talk about basically assessing a nonprofit in terms of readiness to scale. I happen to have a deep, it's not anger, it's not entertainment, but it's something like that. But particularly if you're on a campus, you will see any number of young, excited, social entrepreneurs. And when you listen about what their organization is doing, you go, and they get really excited. Kim never lets me tell you who these people or organizations are. Bonnie will tell you who they are. And so I will tell you that when you meet a young, excited social entrepreneur, the first thing I would do is ask them those basic questions. What is your mission? What's your theory of change? How are you going to achieve it? And is there, forget about the measurement, is there at least a logic that if you can accomplish what you're talking about, that it will result in that? So often, and again, particularly on campus, we want to be encouraging of young people. We'll cut them a pass. And I go, maybe not. Maybe not. Because not the least of which is you know, the venture philanthropy movement, which thankfully is faded into the sunset and now is under this vast umbrella of impact investing. Well, you know, I talked about Bill Drayton. You know, nobody knew about Ashoka or even really social entrepreneurship for close to 15 or 20 years, right? I mean, a lot of these things, Landesa, similarly, a lot of the best, highest impact nonprofits, they take a decade or two just to begin to flesh out their model. The chances that we will have immediate impact or even proof of concept in 3 to 5 years in general is like 0. But of course, we on campuses in particular want to believe that, you know, some 23-year-old, well, we got one of my former students, he goes to villages in Kenya and says, hi, I'm here to help you. Now, we used to call that colonialism, right? And I think we can sort of basically say colonialism was, you know, not as good as Africa as it was for the colonialists. But you meet this young social entrepreneur, my God, I mean, you want to introduce him to all your friends, right? And he raises money right and left. And the point is the focus, the theory of change, the strategy, it's just not there. I mean, you know, it's just not there, as much as you'd love it to be. That was pretty good. I just, you know. Anybody know who I was talking about? At Stanford, they do.
So Kim, as a funder, so you now, you know, you do both theory and practice. And one of the chapters that you talk, I think you call it what counts. That's the sort of Einstein, you know, not everything can be counted, or not everything that counts can be counted. Please, thank you. But then
not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts.
Okay, perfect. So this is why you call yourself analytics who love Yates, right?
Right.
You're right. You're both poetical and quantitative. So, Kim, how do you think about that? You say you see a huge number of potential grantees who come through your door. Everyone is using. I mean, we're competing tonight. Michael Weinstein's across town discussing impact matters, you know, and he's reduced everything to accommodate. You know, he has one set of evaluations. Others are using another. Do you feel like there is one definitive metric or evaluation? Is it the process? How are you thinking about counting what counts?
Well, it's certainly critical that at King Philanthropies that grants that we make go to organizations that are measuring and evaluating their impact. And, you know, it's typically considered to be the gold standard randomized evaluations. These are sort of RCTs as they're used in medicine. And, you know, we love that at King Philanthropies. But I would also put in a plug for thoughtful evaluation. And it's such a common thing in the sector for people to say, oh, but, you know, our intervention, it's so qualitative in nature, you can't measure it. And we would argue that you can learn something from at least trying. If you can measure something as touchy-feely as that, perhaps, you know, your program to raise the income of farmers in Malawi can actually measure whether or not you were increasing the income of farmers in Malawi that you were working with. And so, you know, I think it's both qualitative and quantitative, but every organization can learn something from doing evaluation. It's still it's not nearly common enough in the sector, and you know, in our own grant making, it's a priority.
So a couple of other things. So first of all evaluation and performance analysis, cost-benefit analysis. One of the things about this sector is, you know, the saying about standing on the shoulders of giants. We don't do that. We reinvent. I mean, I can tell from the faces, a lot of you are around for the 60s, you know, the Defense Department and others. You know, we invented cost-benefit analysis, and, you know, I mean, a lot of very, very smart people did things like measure the value of a human life. Now, I'm not saying that that's, you know, of course, that's a very speculative thing. But there's a long history of doing this kind of analysis that the nonprofit sector has more or less ignored. Why? Well, the best research shows that less than 10% of donors, philanthropists, and foundations do any analytical evaluation when they make a grant, okay, using information. The minimum standard is, did you compare your organization that you're going to grant to one other organization? The chapter of the book, oh, I loved it. How many of you written a book? Well, one of the things, it's just so good, And so we had to take out 2 chapters, including my favorite called Donor Power. Because Kim and I have had this model that, we're not really going to have rigor in the sector until philanthropists and foundations actually demand these things, right? And then all of a sudden, the nonprofits will begin to behave. And the issue, and so cost-benefit analysis, a cost-benefit analysis, we're sitting at Columbia Business School, there are a lot of people who know how to do cost-benefit analysis. As Kim said, as we all know, most of the value in an analysis is in the process of doing it. I'm going to speak next week in San Antonio to the American Association of Art Museums. And one of the things I'm going to tell them is the art museums have not done a very good job of articulating what is the value of art in a community. You want to put a number on that? I know they're going to put economic development, tourists come in, they come to the museum, and to me that's kind of beside the point, right? If you're leading an art museum, if you're, all sorts of things, you're going to have to be able to, maybe it's quantitative, but you're going to have to be able to articulate something like the value of art. And if you're defensive, if the investment banker on the board insists on a number and you get, go crazy, it's just not going to work. The last thing I'll say is you all know about SROI, social rate of return, and I think Jed too, Jed Emerson, and we all know Jed Emerson, who's really been, he introduced SROI measurement, and he introduced blended value, which has become impact investing. Really quite a big thinker. The only problem is nobody's actually ever calculated SROI. That's a bit of an exaggeration. But SROI is just a cost-benefit analysis. And until the money people begin to demand it, it's not going to become pervasive in the sector. It's just not.
All right. I know there are a lot of questions, so I just want to ask one more, and then we'll open it up. I've talked a bit about boards, but everyone in this room in some capacity is probably a donor, either, because, in terms of personal time, personal donations, or because we're involved in larger institutions that make larger institutional gifts investments. If you think about sort of the field of philanthropy in the next 10 years, you talk in the book a bit about the gap that we think we'll face, but what should donors be thinking about most? Should they be doing impact investing? Should they be doing measurement evaluation, taking board seats? Sort of, what's your best advice to donors of all sizes and shapes?
My best advice to donors is that they focus for the same reasons that we advise nonprofit leaders to focus their organization on one or a small number of things. Donors also can benefit from focusing. There's lots of different ways to focus. It can be based on your personal passions or your skills, what you bring to the table. And the third way to focus is based on doing some actual analysis and identifying where it is that there is the greatest potential impact that you can have, where are the greatest unmet needs and what are the highest impact efforts. But in any event, however you focus, I do think that focusing in the end is potentially one of the most helpful things that you can do for yourself.
And so about 3 weeks ago, we were at an event here, and our interviewer was from the Rockefeller Foundation. This question came up, and I said, how many program areas the Rockefeller Foundation has? He says, 7 or 8. What's the chance that you can be good at 7 or 8 things? You got program officers getting paid $150,000, $180,000. These are really complex issues. So I agree with the focus. The other thing is, and we talk about it in the book, the twin forces of philanthropy are impact and recognition. Almost all money now is still given for recognition. We're a member of our class. We want to be part of that class. We like our names on buildings. We want to be part of that. And, who knows whether it'll happen. But if you're a philanthropist, picking that apart for yourself, I got no problem with recognition if you're having impact. Recognition for recognition's sake, it just doesn't get me going. And I think philanthropists and frankly foundation executives, be very clear, right? Are you really trying to have impact? And if you are, there is a science to it, right? If you're just having recognition, go right ahead, throw the dinner.
Open it up to questions for Bill and Kim.
I went to Columbia Business School before there were social entrepreneurs for the purpose of going into the nonprofit world and working on social change issues. Actually, for the purpose of helping worker-owned businesses. But I found myself in the career of nonprofits. And everything that you're saying, I've worked with Bob Hood Foundation, with venture philanthropists, all these others. And I love what you're saying on so many levels. One of the things that strikes me is that you're calling for conceptual clarity. That's a practice of rigor in your logical thinking, your use of language about what we're trying to do here, and the line of and I could not agree more. And I found that that's been the lever that trying to get people to get that, sometimes my boss, sometimes others, while I've been in organizations and leadership roles, has been the real challenge. And so my question is, do you have an idea about how we can promote across the sector the rigor in thinking? And in fact, it's also that passion for language, passion for clarity of use of language, because these words really matter. You'll keep returning to them and using them as a benchmark and a test. And that's what I found in it. That's how you get, what happens, you get an undergraduate anthro major who becomes a bit.
So can I not answer your question and talk about, you mentioned worker-owned businesses. One of the things that's going on is, again, like impact investing, blended value, B Corps, hybrids, all this sort of stuff. And there's a book written by Henry Hansman called The Ownership of Enterprise. And I don't, all this, Lord knows, I don't think much is going to come with it. But Vanguard is a mutual, best mutual fund country in the world. Northwestern Mutual is a life insurance company leading its thing. What's not happening to me is why we're not revisiting mutuals, worker-owned co-ops, and other forms that we know might work to provide what you might call as hybrid. And the last thing I'll say to your central question is it's the money. The rigor will only come when the donors demand it. And the second order possibility is boards. But I find the typical nonprofit board farcical. You sit there and you go, all these smart people.
I agree with Bill. It will only come with donors. In the interim, if you're trying to work with your own organization and trying to introduce clarity, in addition to purchasing copies of Engine of Impact, I want to send you to our website. We have a book website, engineofimpact.org, and we developed a diagnostic tool that organizations have found very, very useful. Basically, you can have different stakeholders within your organization all take it, and then it will place you in our matrix showing where the strengths and weaknesses are against the 7 dimensions. And what's useful is have different people take it and then come together for a discussion and see where the areas not only of similarity are in viewpoint, but more importantly, where the areas of difference in viewpoint. And that can be sort of a starting point for discussion for your organization about where we need to focus, where are weaknesses, and how can we get better as an organization.
Sir.
You had mentioned the issue of clarity and specificity of donors. But what about the leadership of a nonprofit and getting the board to focus on what they need to be deciding upon?
Agreed. It's hard to make gross generalizations. This relationship between staff and board. It's compromised. And a lot of staff, don't really want the board to know all the details, to be involved in the big decisions. You know, that, you know, the joke is, you know, make sure that you're signed the check before the door hits you on the backside when leaving the meeting. And you know, I've gotten to the point where I'll only chair a board or be an advisor. I won't be a participant on a nonprofit board because I'm just tired of being the bad guy. And you know, if the virus of corporate boards is cronyism, the virus of nonprofit boards is that peer social pressure that we all feel. Oh no, I can ask this question or make this statement, in which case I will either be viewed as stupid or offensive. Not a great choice. And so my deal always with staff has been, I want full preparation. I want you to answer every question I have. And if you do, I will do all I can to deliver the board. And if you don't do that, good luck. Right, and so, you know, people ask about Sarbanes-Oxley's and other things. You know, they're really, you know, they're, and I'm not suggesting there should be, but, you know, somebody told me there are 2 million nonprofit board members in America or something like that. And like corporate boards, I think there's only one secret, which is if you have 2 or 3 serious, committed, interested, knowledgeable board members, you've got a good board. And they'll bring the culture along. I was on the San Francisco Symphony board for 27 years. And it's like an 85-person board. It was one of the best boards I've ever been on. It had a culture of seriousness, right? It treated the board members serious, and the board meetings had serious discussions. And it was because there were always people like that. But it's a tough thing, and I'm very harsh in my judgment in the sense that if you're sitting in a nonprofit board meeting and it's not going any place and the staff won't yield to your questions, resign. I'm sorry. You know, turning around a nonprofit board, I've done it a couple of times. You know, I have at least 2 retiring executive directors who've never talked to me again. It's not a fun thing, right? And so you sit there and go, I'm going to find you know, listen, there's so many terrific nonprofits which would benefit from your leadership and your network. Find 1 or 2 and use on them. And it's sad, but you know, if it doesn't yield to your charm, go.
I think many of us nonprofit leaders are still like deer in headlights over the new tax law.
Yeah.
Any comments, any words of encouragement whatsoever in terms of what this all means for us?
Yeah, somebody asked us today. No, we haven't studied it, and I don't think as long as we're doing the book tour, we're going to study it, because otherwise we might be, you know, viewed as authoritative. You know, so years and years ago, I went to the first meeting between McKinsey and the Gates Foundation. And I was not asked to the second meeting because I said to Gates Sr. that I thought we needed a new FIFA commission to look at the, you know, the conduct of the nonprofit sector, which was last looked in the 60s. And he decided, quote, I was too cool in school. And I think he was right. You know, it's too bad, even the tax on endowments. The sector is unique in the world. 75% of the hospital beds in the US are nonprofits. Almost all of our high-end cultural institutions. 15 or 17 of the top 25 universities in the world are private US universities. We are deep critics of all sorts of stuff, but this is a unique thing. And you know, let's just, you know, get out the vote in 2020 is all I got to say. You know, I mean, there's so much we could start with this one, but the unintended consequences of this are for sure. Forget about the intended consequences, but the unintended consequences are going to be very damaging. And so, sorry for punting, but it's hard to know.
I work for an initiative at the Clinton Foundation, and we...
A fine best practices example.
Yeah, the lesson learned. So we start, operate, and scale social businesses around the world, and I think your point on mission and focus really rings true for us. I think we have a big issue there that we're trying to be everything. The question I have, though, is that I come from the private sector, and one of my frustrations in this space is that very few people tell the truth about whether what they're doing is working or not.
In the nonprofit sector.
In the nonprofit
Yeah.
sector, and as a result.
Do they know the truth and they're hiding it, or they don't know the truth?
Yes.
Yeah.
And because it doesn't pay right now, to be honest. Because
Yeah.
everyone's there just to survive as
Yeah,
an entity.
yeah.
Aside from donors coming to the party demanding that kind of rigor and honesty, how would you engineer that from an internal point of view, where you're trying to drive that honesty?
I mean, again, we're all, if you're involved in nonprofits, you got a bit of a complex of trying to save something big. And I'm telling you, resign. No, I mean, because there are lots of wonderful organizations and places to spend your time and money, and find one. The other thing is, I'm looking for an opportunity, and social businesses, and talk about not telling the truth. The whole impact investing movement is built on how shall I say this? A lie. Right? Because listen, very quickly. If you have public equities, and now the investment firms and the private bankers own impact investing, and I can guarantee you that when the history of the nonprofit sector and philanthropy of this period is written, that impact investing will be described as the biggest trend of our time. So we got private equities, and anybody knows anything about finance, is if you decide to take coal out of your portfolio, the impact on the coal industry is nothing. So you're in private equity. We know there are lots of big funds, blah, 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 that are starting. What the big impact investing private equity funds are going to do is they're going to invest in healthcare, education, maybe frontier markets, all of whom are full return markets that have intrinsic social impact, and they're not bringing incremental capital, right? And so social businesses, first of all, they're based on a notion that businesses don't have social impact. Only certain kinds of businesses do. That's kind of specious. And so there's all sorts of stuff that's fraught there.
I have an intellectual honesty question.
Please.
And for both of you, but I want to start with Kim as a donor and a funder. So you've both said repeatedly that the way we're going to see results or the exercise of measuring results has to be donor driven. And I guess, Bill, you mentioned colonialism. There's a huge asymmetry, as you both know, in the power dynamic between those of us who are funding and the nonprofits that we serve. Some of whom may not be telling the truth necessarily, many of whom, most of whom know a heck of a lot more about what's going on the ground and what the solutions are. So, and then as funders, we don't necessarily provide them the funding to do the analysis. So talk about what funders, you might demand it, but in addition to demanding, what else really you need to be doing to encourage this type of sort of performance or process?
There's a number of things. I always joke that if a Martian came down from outer space and took a look at the sector, he would find it completely perplexing because we have all of these practices that are so dysfunctional, and many of them start with funders. And so one example is one-year grants, which is the norm today. Well, the problem is if a nonprofit has to re-raise money every single year, even the best ones, if there's squishy facts, and they might be prone to, right? Because they got it. So at King Philanthropies, we are making multi-year grants. We are making 3-year commitments with an assumption that if all goes well, we'll continue after that. And what that does is free up the conversation so that things can be more honest.
And we grant to organizations, not programs.
Yes. And so they're unrestricted in nature, so that organizations can use funds for impact evaluation, because that is another way that we can prevent the lying, right? Like, what's the evaluation show? What is the data? Has there been a third party? Is it an external evaluator or not? And is it a rigorous evaluation? Is it an RCT, or is it something else? And so, those things, they're practices that are driven by funders, but really help shape the conversation. And I'm not going to suggest that, grantees or potential grantees aren't lying to us. And of course, that's the sector. But there are certain practices that we can undertake that make it much less.
Yeah, I read yesterday, the Hewlett Foundation, which in my opinion is the best of the first generation of the tech titan foundations. 1,100 grants last year. Wow, that's a lot of work. And I started McKinsey's private equity practice. Any of you know private equity? In 6 to 8 weeks, they will cut $500 million checks and borrow $2 or $3 billion from JP Morgan Chase, right? People make this nonprofit evaluation thing so harder than it is, and they end up writing a $2 million check, and you go, come on, it's either a great idea or it's not. Anyway.
All right, I think we have time for one or two more, yeah.
First of all, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
I'm curious about, I know you don't want to talk about tax law, that's fine, but I'm curious that the book was fairly quiet about the role of advocacy in nonprofits. And I would pose that given the current political climate, but throughout the history of the nonprofit sector in America, the voice of the nonprofit, civil rights, and various issues has been very important. And you really are kind of quiet on it in the book. I'm kind of curious about your thoughts about the role of advocacy.
Because I don't think we know anything about it. So as you know, 501c3s have very severe restrictions about advocacy and lobbying. And I think that's a good thing, right? And so we have this phenomenon now, 501c4s, which have taken that. And a lot of the newer, I was going to call them foundations, entities in Silicon Valley, Emerson Collective and Zuckerberg, their heart lies with advocacy and influencing public policy and politics. And again, I don't think any of us profess any knowledge of that. It's a whole other deal, right? And influencing policy making and political races and that kind of stuff, good luck to them, right? We're really almost only talking about nonprofits that have an operational effect. I've taught this case on Planned Parenthood for many, many years. And Planned Parenthood does four things, right? It has the delivery mechanisms we all know. It does research. It has some standard setting. And then it also does advocacy. Well, why do they do advocacy? Well, obviously it's an issue that lends itself to that. But it just turns out that many, many donors would rather give money to advocacy than to clinics. And so I don't think most nonprofits I have exposure to have the skill of advocacy. I think it's obviously a hugely important thing. And we'll see whether the Emerson Collectives and the Chan Zuckerbergs and the others develop that skill. It's very unclear to me. And so if you find that answer unsatisfying, it's because it is.
I think if there was one more, and then Kim and Bill will stay, and there's snacks, and anyway, we can continue in smaller groups, but please.
Thank you very much. One of the things that you mentioned comes to mind is that there's this tension between focus that a nonprofit needs to have in order to develop a culture of excellence and to deliver on its mission, and then the fact that donors often want to fund innovative things. And every 3 years, you get a new cycle of program officers. They probably don't want to follow what the person did before. They want new ideas. So how do you suggest that, donors restrain some of those impulses to always be changing things up? And at the same time, nonprofits are able to deliver a consistent message to their donors about what's important, as opposed to bucking into the new flavor of the day.
It's a very good question. I agree with you. Lots of donors want to be associated with things that appear to be innovative. And whether they are or they not is another question. And new is very often considered a proxy for innovative. When you look at, what Landesa does, right? In many, many ways, it's very, very innovative, even if it's based on something we've known for years, which is if you give a tenant farmer ownership in their land, the productivity of the land, skyrockets. So, if you think this is a tough question to answer in Manhattan, in Palo Alto, it's impossible. And, I can get pretty cynical about the latest generation, not so much Gates, but some of these guys, and their attitude is, just imagine, the first thing you ever did at the age of 19 is worth $100 billion and changed the world. And so many of them come to the philanthropy and nonprofit sector with that mindset. And, we all know, a half a dozen of the core issues that nonprofits in this country are focused on do not have a settled theory of change. Okay, please tell us, and then we'll wrap up, all the proven interventions that improve educational outcomes in U.S. public K through 12 education. Anyone? Harlem's Children's Zone? No. And so, they also don't like to believe that, right? So thank you for giving me the second opportunity to be unsatisfying.
Kim, last word on shiny and new.
It's good for some. At King Philanthropies, we do have some of that, and funders can also think about things in terms of a portfolio, which can be helpful. So there can be some for innovation and new things, and then some for proven. And we like proven at King Philanthropies.
Terrific. Okay, well.
Well, thank you all. And
Thank
please
you
buy
all.
the
Thank you,
book.
Bill.
Buy the book.
Thank you.